Vehicles, whether pulled by horses or like trucks or planes or helicopters, have always been used by militaries in order to move troops and equipment and supplies quickly across a battlefield. But one vehicle you might not immediately associate with the military is the motorcycle. And yet motorcycles have been used in war almost from the moment that they were invented. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The turn of the 20th century saw a vast expansion in motorcycle production. Many bicycle companies began designing and selling motorcycles as well. In 1901, the Indian Motorcycle Manufacturing Company designed the diamond-framed Indian Single. Indian would produce 32,000 bikes in 1913. Harley-Davidson began building motorcycles in 1903. By the time of the First World War, motorcycles had evolved beyond being bicycles with a motor into a unique technology in their own right. Bicycles had already been brought to the battlefield, and by the end of the 19th century, most European armies had a bicycle component. Cyclist maneuvers were first held in the UK in 1887, involving British volunteer units, and France created several experimental bicycle units in 1886. Bicycles offered some distinct advantages to horses, as that they could be manufactured, while supplies of horses could become scarce, and they didn't require feeding, and they could be repaired. Belgian and Dutch forces had large bicycle units, and the Italian sharpshooter Bersaglieri units used bicycles as part of their mission to move quickly as skirmishers. In Russia, bikes with outrigger wheels patrolled along the Siberian Railway during the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. Possibly the first instance of bikes in warfare in many ways predicted the ways that motorcycles would be used in combat. Bicyclists served as dispatch riders in the Jameson Raid in 1895, a failed attempt to overthrow the Transvaal Boers by British volunteers. An article in the Boston Globe describes the bicyclist who took the last letter to Jameson, Arthur Maynard Rowland, who acted as a dispatch rider. They were also used by scouting units in the Second Anglo-Boer War, such as the Donny Tyrone Boer Reconnaissance Corps, which British Commander Lord Roberts called the hardest thorn in the flesh of the British advance. Roberts placed a bounty on the commander's head. The era of the First World War saw the use of bicycles and motorcycles on a large scale. German light infantry battalions each had a bicycle company at the beginning of the war, and Germany eventually formed 8 bicycle battalions. The British eventually had 2 entire cyclist divisions. In the earliest part of the war, Belgian cyclist companies performed significant roles. In the United States, motorcycles were first used in combat at the same time that war was raging in Europe. Mexico was in the midst of a revolution, and trouble between rebel leader Pancho Villa and the U.S. had been boiling since at least 1915, when the U.S. recognized Villa's rival, Venustiano Carranza, as the head of the Mexican government. The conflict boiled over when Villa's troops attacked Columbus, New Mexico on March 9, 1916. 10 American civilians and 8 soldiers were killed in the attack. General John J. Black Jack Pershing was quickly sent to chase Villa's men back across the border. His army had been testing motorcycles since at least 1913, and Pershing's army had a number of Harley-Davidson J-Series motorcycles, which included sidecar-equipped motorcycles for transport and sidecars fitted with machine guns. Some were outfitted to carry pigeons for communication. According to the Daily Capital Journal of Salem, Oregon, immediately after the attack at Columbus, the Army called for additional machines, which were sent by rail from Milwaukee to the border in 33 hours. They were used primarily for dispatch bearing and maintaining the lines of communication. The biggest problem was finding people with experience driving and maintaining motorcycles. Villa also used motorcycles like the Indian Power Plus, largely in courier roles, where the vehicles proved useful on flat desert ground. Fighting from motorcycles was rare, and both the Mexicans and the Americans still maintained horse-mounted cavalry units. And despite some sensational news reports, American soldiers did not ride their motorcycles, guns blazing, into crowds of Villa's banditos. In a 1916 article in the Baltimore Sun, an Indian motorcycle representative called motorcycles an indispensable part of the modern equipment of war. Motorcycles were simultaneously being deployed across the Atlantic, where war had been raging since 1914. Even before the war, modern armies had been mechanizing. In 1913, the British put together contingency plans in case they were dragged into war on the continent, which called for the initial deployment of 6 divisions, 165,000 men, 1,200 motor vehicles, and 179 motorcycles, in addition to 2,500 bicycles. Commander Charles Sampson, a British naval aviation pioneer, was among the first to utilize motor vehicles in the war when he used cars to move dispatches and retrieve airmen who landed in hostile territory. He eventually armored his Mercedes and Rolls-Royce cars and armed them, leading to the formation of the Naval Airmen's Armored Car Force, which eventually included 20 squadrons, including 5 with motorcycle sidecar combinations. When the Western Front bogged down into trench warfare, the units saw service in Russia, Romania, and the Middle East. With both sides seeking high mobility, the British War Department called for motorcyclists to volunteer for dispatch work the same month, and thousands responded. The British primarily used the Triumph Type H, the first motorcycle not to include pedals, and is often cited by historians as the first modern motorcycle. It proved so reliable in the rough terrain of the war that it earned the nickname the Trusty Triumph. Triumph sold more than 30,000 motorcycles to the Allies, while Harley-Davidson devoted more than half of its output to military contracts by 1918. When the U.S. entered the war, they placed orders for 40,000 motorcycles from Indian and another 20,000 from Harley-Davidson. By 1918, the BEF had more than 55,000 trucks in service, along with over 14,000 motorcycles. The British created the Motor Machine Gun Service in November 1914, which attached a motor machine gun battery, or MMG, to each division as part of the Royal Field Artillery. The offices of the Motorcycle Magazine in Coventry became a recruiting office. And by September of 1915, 18 MMG batteries, including 2 Canadian, were in service. Each battery included 18 motorcycle sidecar combinations carrying Vickers machine guns, 8 motorcycles without sidecars, and a sidecar combination for the commanding officer. In the earliest part of the war, they used Scott's motorcycles, as well as a small number of Premier, Zenith, Enfield, and Kleino cycles. Some 70,000 motorcycles were ordered from Douglas, based in Bristol. These units were largely sidelined by trench warfare and sent to other theaters. However, motorcyclists remained on the Western Front in what was likely their most successful deployment, as dispatch riders. A report in a 1915 edition of the Wilmington, Delaware Evening Journal remarked on the adaptation of different forces engaged of the latest inventions, highlighting a French pilot handing his report to a motorcycle dispatch rider. The riders of these motorcycles are almost as intrepid as the men in the air. 100 miles an hour is common for them, it added. The Germans also embraced the motorcycle. In the beginning of the war, they were extremely under-motorized, but by August of 1915, they had more than 1,700 motorcycles in service, all of them civilian models commandeered for military service. Germany faced more severe issues of supply than the Entente, especially in getting gasoline and rubber, and later in the war, Germans tested using potato alcohol to power engines and using emergency war tires made entirely of steel and cushioned with springs. In the final years, Germany could only fuel and supply around 40,000 motor vehicles, including around 5,400 motorcycles, while the Allies had almost 200,000 by 1918. Exact numbers for German production are more difficult to ascertain, but thousands were impressed from Germany and occupied territories. When military versions were produced, they were largely built by Wanderer, although TWN, a Nuremberg company started by the same man who began Triumph in the UK, and NSU also produced motorcycles for the Imperial German Army. The end of World War I changed the world, including the world of motorcycles. Indian had devoted nearly all production to the war effort, which led to a loss of civilian dealers that seriously hampered its civilian market. Harley-Davidson had maintained a civilian market that allowed it to dominate the market in the coming years. A drop in demand, combined with the Great Depression, ended many other manufacturers in the interwar years. The American Army continued to buy motorcycles, however, and according to Rob Cogan, a curator at the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Benning, around a third of Army cavalry scouts were on motorcycles in the 30s and 40s. World War II reinvigorated demand for military motorcycles. Every country fielded them, seemed as a low-cost way to give infantry mobility. Like in World War I, they were used for communication when other methods failed, as well as transporting cargo and injured soldiers. Harley-Davidson produced the WLA, an Army version of their civilian 45-degree V-twin WL, also called the Liberator. They would ultimately produce around 70,000 WLAs, many of which were sent to the USSR as part of the Lend-Lease program. Unlike in World War I, very few were intended for combat usage, and few used sidecars. Indian produced around 1,000 841s, a design purpose-built for desert warfare. Other Indian models were sent to war zones via Lend-Lease. UK and Commonwealth forces commonly used the Norton Model 1, more commonly known as the Big Four, and the 16H. Nearly 100,000 of the machines were made during the war, almost a quarter of the total number of motorcycles used by British forces, and they saw service on every front. The only machine more common was the Birmingham Small Arms M20, with 126,000 eventually seeing active service. One of the factories in Birmingham was a priority target for the Luftwaffe and was bombed on November 19, 1940. 53 workers were killed and another 89 injured. Triumph also produced motorcycles for the military, primarily the 3 SWs. The 5 SW model was also produced before the November 14th bombing of Coventry, which destroyed Triumph's factory. The British also used around 80,000 matchless G3 LS, several thousand of the aerial Wing 350 and the Velocette. In addition, British forces used the Royal Enfield WD-RE, meaning War Department Royal Enfield, a lightweight machine nicknamed the Flying Flea, which was designed to be dropped by parachute. In the UK, women who served with the Women's Royal Navy Service, nicknamed the Wrens, served in both wars, sometimes on motorcycles as dispatch riders. Nearly 75,000 of them served during World War II. Others served as part of the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service. According to Motorcyclist Online, 303 women died in active service, and almost 100 of them were dispatch riders. Pamela McGeorge, a Wren and dispatch rider, was blown off her motorcycle on April 22, 1941, by a Luftwaffe bombing run. She ran the remaining half-mile while bombs continued to fall to deliver her message and was awarded the British Empire Medal for her heroism. By 1940, all of the Royal Navy's dispatch riders were women. The Belgian motorcycle company Fabrique Nationale manufactured the M12, specifically designed for military use and capable of reaching 62 miles per hour. The M12 ceased production after Germany conquered Belgium, and all remaining machines were confiscated. Some saw service with the German army on the Eastern Front. The Germans primarily used two kinds of motorcycles, the BMW R75 and the Zundap KS750. Ultimately, the KS750 was determined to be the superior machine, although both used many of the same parts and featured a two-wheel shaft-driven design that powered both a rear wheel and a wheel in the sidecar. This led the U.S. Army to request that Harley-Davidson produce a similar design, which became the nearly identical Davidson XA, Harley's first shaft-driven design. German vehicles were sometimes equipped with an MG34 attached to the sidecar. DKW and Victoria also produced several military motorcycle designs for the German Army. The Italians made broad use of Moto Guzzi motorcycles, including the Moto Guzzi GT20 and a three-wheeler version. They were used to motorize infantry regiments for transport of supplies and to carry radios. Some had machine guns mounted at the rear. They were also used to tow light artillery. Multiple countries produced motorcycles that were essentially copies of foreign designs. The Soviet Union built the M72, which was based on the BMW R71. Around 16,000 were built during the war. The Soviets had used several motorcycle designs in the Winter War against Finland, which had proved inadequate and were built throughout the war, mostly with sidecars attached. Soviet machines, as well as more than 21,000 WLAs they received through Lend-Lease, were sometimes configured with a platform for an 82mm mortar as a transport. The Soviets also saw various other British and American cycles, such as Matchless and Indian. One Soviet soldier who served with the 6th Guards Tank Army recalled that his motorcycle regiment was sent if the enemy broke through our army's defenses somewhere or to pursue retreating Germans as infantry that could move quickly. The Japanese also saw the value in motorcycles, developing the Type 93 sidecar motorcycle and the Type 97 Rikuo, both copies of Harley-Davidson machines. There were some odd experiments as well, such as the British Excelsior Motor Company's Well Bike, a foldable motorcycle commissioned by the Special Operations Executive to be sent with paratroopers. It was used during Operation Market Garden, and it was largely considered a failure. The U.S. purchased over 4,000 Cushman airborne scooters, a single-cylinder machine that could be mounted with a mortar or machine gun and used by paratroopers. More well-known is the German-designed half-track motorcycle called the Kettenkrad, meant to be a light tractor for airborne troops. Around 8,000 were built during the war. Although designed for airborne troops, they were mostly used on the Eastern Front for transportation, laying cable and pulling equipment. Their half-track design gave them excellent hill climbing capability. For the Allies, the motorcycle was largely replaced by the Jeep in most roles, which proved more durable, versatile, and effective. Motorcycles did continue to see use in the military, especially among military police, in conflicts such as Vietnam and Korea. Maybe the largest impact in post-World War II America, however, was motorcycle culture. Motorcycles sold cheap as surplus after the war were snapped up by soldiers, who soon chopped off all the unnecessary military pieces like the rifle racks, blackout lights, and the like, giving us the term American chopper and heavily influencing motorcycle design. This also led to a proliferation of motorcycle clubs, attracting large numbers of former soldiers who sought the camaraderie of their war years, along with the excitement of the bikes and the counterculture movement. This was also part of the rise of outlaw motorcycle gangs. Motorcycle clubs, including the 13 Rebels and the Booze Fighters, made up of mainly veterans, took part in the July 1947 Hollister invasion, in which the clubs overwhelmed the small town of Hollister, California, during an American Motorcyclist Association rally. Press sensationalism of the event raised fear of gangs of motorcycle hoodlums throughout the nation. In Europe, designs focused on cheap machines to offer transport to a continent that had seen much of its infrastructure destroyed. This helped to drive the popularity of machines like the Vespa scooter, which was selling more than 60,000 units a year by 1950. Motorcycles remain in use by militaries and unconventional forces throughout the world. They're used for fast transport, for scouting, even in their traditional role as dispatch carriers, although that role has largely been supplanted by advancing technology. American Special Forces like the 75th Ranger Regiment sometimes use tactical motorcycles like the Kawasaki M1030, the KLR 250D8, and the Christini AWD. The U.S. Marines have used bikes like the BMW R1200 GS, and the Air Force Special Operations Command have used mini bikes for survey purposes. And perhaps the future of motorcycles in combat can be seen in the ongoing war in Ukraine, where Ukrainian forces are using e-bikes, or electrically powered motorcycles, to carry anti-tank missiles. These types of e-bikes, like the Zero MMX, which has also been used by the United States, are quiet, thus allowing soldiers to move stealthily around the battlefield. It seems like the history of motorcycles and militaries isn't going to end anytime soon. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.